Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills are the videos where I talk about the books that I've recently finished reading. I haven't made a video in a few weeks, so what I'm going to be talking about today are 3 books that I read at the end of November. And they all deal in one way or another with religion. I'm going to talk about them in the order in which I read them. And I always, well, I don't always, but I frequently say at the beginning of these sorts of videos that I don't consider these videos to be book reviews. They're more just book discussions. My videos are informal, they are unscripted, they are minimally edited. They're just me getting out my thoughts. And I emphasize often that these are not book reviews and more discussions because of times like this. I am not trying to let you know if these are worth your time or objectively talk about these. I read these for specific reasons, and I will talk about the reasons that I read them and how they resonated with me or what I got out of them. So I think there's a little preamble that needs to be taken care of first before I get into these. So all these deal with religion. I myself, I am an agnostic atheist. I realized I was that definitely by the time I was a teenager, that I was somebody who never really had faith. When I left Christianity in my teens, I did experiment just a very short time with Wicca, but very quickly I pretty much just became a secular humanist. And that was what I was very comfortable with for many decades. I'm in my 40s now. And for the most part, I still kind of consider myself a secular humanist. However, over the past year or so, I've become more and more interested in the power of ritual. Okay, I'm not thinking about faith. That's not really my concern. But ritual has really interested me, and especially things like nature-based ritual, things that you find in neo-paganism, in witchcraft. I've been very intrigued by what I would call the crossroads between ritual, nature-based worship, but then also maybe how a sort of atheist worldview can intersect with those things. So this is just something that I've been kind of personally interested in. I've been incorporating certain sorts of, I would say, atheo-pagan practices into my life, not in big ways, but more to mark the seasons, doing like a variation on the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. I take a lot of inspiration from heathenry, not necessarily in a polytheistic way, but I like the ritual, the aesthetics, those sorts of things. So I'm not going into detail with those. I just want to let you know kind of where I'm coming from when I'm looking at these. So the first thing that I read was a Joseph Campbell book, Pathways to Bliss. Now, most people are probably familiar with Joseph Campbell, especially from his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and also he did that interview series with Bill Moyers, 1980s, The Power of Myth, which was also made into a book. And I had read The Power of Myth years ago when I was young, and I saw those interviews, and I thought they were terrific. So that really, Campbell really captured my imagination there. And I read years later Hero with a Thousand Faces, which I don't think aged very well, but I kind of understand the impact that it had. And I've read a little, some things here and there from Joseph Campbell. Now what this is, these are from the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Yeah. So these are like collected works, they call them. These were not things that he wrote to be published in this way. So what we have here are things like pieces that he wrote or lectures that he gave that have been pretty much, made into some sort of book form. And they all deal with, it's called Pathways to Bliss. It's kind of dealing with how myth can apply to one's life. One of the things about Joseph Campbell is that he saw myth as being sort of very electric in people's lives, very engaging. He saw the power of metaphor. And I've always liked the way that he's spoken of mythology, of the kind of lessons that we can draw from it. He was also very insistent that our current mythology was not really in keeping with our current needs, that we were in need of a new type of mythology, a new way to interact with metaphor and with symbology. And there's a lot of that sort of thing in here. He goes very deep into like Sigmund Freud and Jung. A lot of these things are from mid-20th century. So, it's not like it's the most up-to-date psychology. He died, I think, in the late 80s. So he's been gone for a while. he was somebody who I believe, if I remember correctly, I think came from a Catholic background, but he wasn't somebody who had faith by the end of his life. But he was immensely interested, again, in myth and metaphor and how it could apply to people's lives. So this book, it's not a how-to guide. It is not going to teach you how to find your pathway to bliss. It is more like him kind of barely skimming the surface over and over again on the topic, almost making an argument for the journey, but not at all giving you a pathway to it. And again, he didn't write this with that intention. These are just collected works that have been edited and gathered. There were some gems in here that I liked, and this comes from my interest in things like ritual. A couple quotes in here that I liked. And I've been looking a lot into, like I said, different types of neo-paganism, and this made me think of the way that I've seen a lot of, current day polytheists and neo-pagans practicing. And this little passage just really made me think about, again, what I'm seeing. He says, you can get some clues from earlier traditions, but they have to be taken as clues. As many a wise man has said, you can't wear another person's hat. So when people get excited about the Orient and begin putting on turbans and saris, what they've gotten caught in is the folk aspect of wisdom that they need. You've got to find the wisdom, not the clothing of it. Through those trappings, the myths of other cultures, you can come to a wisdom that you've then got to translate into your own. The whole problem is to turn these mythologies into your own. And that's one of the things that I'm certainly interested in doing. When I say that I have been adopting things like, certain atheo-pagan aspects and aspects of heathery, I'm adapting it. It's in a very eclectic way. And sorry, there was something else. Yeah, he talked about ritual here. I liked how he said, ritual is simply myth enacted. By participating in a rite, you are participating directly in the myth. So I think it's a really great perspective in how to see ritual. So I thought this was interesting. This is where I get into, this really isn't a review, right? For my purposes, for my interest, I found it worthwhile to read. I wish that there was a little bit more meat on the bone in here, but there's certainly a lot that it gave me to think about, to consider, and it was a nice kind of jumping off point. I'm actually glad that I read this and then moved on to the next read, which this I read for Historathon. Historathon is a year-long reading event where we read nonfiction history, and I chose this because this is something that is relates directly to the sorts of things that I'm interested in, the sorts of things that I'm engaging in. It was by Leigh Schmidt, The Church of St. Thomas Paine, A Religious History of American Secularism. And this is from Princeton University Press. I had read a book by Schmidt about a few years ago. It was also about atheists and free thinkers in the 19th century in the United States, but I'm blanking on the name of it right now. But I enjoyed that. But this was pretty good. This essentially looks at the ways that late 19th century Americans who were atheists, who were often, who obviously left religion, who consider themselves free thinkers and agnostics, how they started engaging in and trying to create a new type of more secularized religion. Thomas Paine keeps coming up again and again. They kind of see him as a patron saint, if you will. The first part of he has the book splits the book into three sections. The first section really deals with the physical remains of Thomas Paine, his grave site, and then his body was actually dug up and brought over to England, and then pieces kind of went everywhere and got lost, and how these sort of atheists would even a lock of his hair would almost be seen as sacred. So in many ways mimicking the type of the fetish worship of the Catholic Church, but doing it through the eyes of somebody who they saw as one of them, as somebody who kind of got the ball rolling, at least in the American sense, for free thought. Especially because, if you don't know Thomas Paine, of course, he was famous for writing Common Sense during the American Revolution, and among other things, he also went over to France during the French Revolution. But when he was imprisoned in France, because he he was a radical to a certain extent. He didn't like the sort of violence, the violent take. I think he was against executing the king and queen, but he got put in prison. And while there, he wrote The Age of Reason, in which he was incredibly critical of certainly the Abrahamic religions. He was a deist, and he was really railing against religion overall in that book. And that basically made him this detestable subject. When he returned, especially to the United States, he was really abandoned by that country, by my country. And I think that a lot of what the secularists were trying to do was rehabilitate him, his name, to reclaim him and to give him the sort of honors that they felt that he was really deserving of. And I totally agree with that sort of thing. There's a lot in here that I kind of sympathize with. When I first realized I was an atheist in high school, I was looking for things, precedent, earlier writings. This is before the so-called New Atheism movement. So everything from Nietzsche to Bertrand Russell to even Thomas Paine. Those were all people that I started gravitating to and trying to read and find basically predecessors to my own worldview. So I totally understand what they're going through. And then this goes into the other two sections, have to do with funeral rites and then organizing churches. And again, I'm kind of understanding where they're coming from now. I think me from even like 2 years ago would not have gotten them quite as much. But with my newfound sort of fascination with ritual, with that sort of thing, with an engagement of certain religious aspects, but without faith, I'm much more on board with the sorts of things they were trying to do. So the first thing had to do with funeral rites, because a lot of times they would see their fellow, free thinkers and atheists, they die, but then you have like a preacher officiate their funeral. And sometimes that preacher was not very understanding of the person who passed away's atheism, right? And they would take the opportunity to preach and maybe condemn the person. So they were horrified by this sort of thing. So what they wanted to do was create secular rites for those who died, to keep their sort of honor, and also to keep people from telling repeated lies about deathbed confessions from atheists. Deathbed conversions, I should say, that all of a sudden their last breaths they accept God. They wanted to avoid that sort of thing. So that's one of the motivations. And then the last section is really about trying to create churches. Now, so many of these churches, they were basically mimicking what they came from in Christianity and just giving it more of a secular, scientific focus. But there would be church gatherings. There would be almost like the equivalent of prayer. And it seems like a lot of these churches didn't last very long. They didn't catch on. And I think there's a reason. I don't think that, I think that they were trying to hold on to, because partly it was nostalgia, I think, or comfort that they felt from that sort of environment. But I don't think that it was conducive to what their worldview was anymore. And of course, most of the atheists didn't want anything to do with that sort of thing. No kind of, just the idea of church they were allergic to. But there was a minority of these people who wanted it. And interestingly, I think the most successful one was a young woman. She was in her 20s. And I'm trying to remember see if I can find her name. Her last name was Smith. And she was out west, and like on the West Coast, and she was probably one of the most successful in gathering large congregants. And I think part of it had to do with the fact that she did not rely on this sort of Christian, Christian blueprint for what a church could be. Instead, she turned to paganism, the thing that I'm more interested in personally. And she seems by far, out of all these, to be the most successful as far as getting people excited, getting people in awe. She seemed to understand what Joseph Campbell, maybe like 2 generations later, would end up understanding, is that you need myth. You can't throw out everything. If you want the ritual to be effective, you need to have a certain amount of play, of myth, of metaphor. And she seemed to really understand that. So she would put on these amazing sort of like stage plays and pageants and had these big celebrations. It says in here, Smith had a especially good feel for pageantry and festival beyond the usual platform of oratory. Take, for example, the Christmas celebration that she and her congregants staged in 1893, which Smith described with emulance. This is, quote, "The festival of the sun god at the First Secular Church of Portland was a grand success. The members of this free thought organization never do anything by halves." And it essentially talks about things like they restaged the burning of Bruno, who was killed in Rome. She says, one congregant, Orville Leigh, described the scene as awe-inspiring. With theatrical effect, the red flames lashed up around Bruno as he burned. He said it was the most enjoyable Christmas evening he had ever experienced. Says the burning of Bruno was a tough act to follow, but Smith did her best with a pointed address, The Origins of Christmas, on how the holiday really honored the sun god, not the son of God. Claiming the seasons for secularists, she rejoiced in pagan merriment. And it goes on to talk about how she found inspiration in paganism. And now she's not promoting paganism necessarily, not a polytheistic view, but because she brought myth and kind of metaphor into her rituals, she seemed to have been very, very successful. Unfortunately, she got sick and died fairly young. She didn't have a chance to keep on growing. But, you know, from reading this to reading this, I really appreciated what she was trying to do. There's also a great quote, this guy Adler. I love what he said here. It was his definition of religion. He said, he then added another layer to his definition. Quote, "Religion is the going out of the soul toward the perfect, the homesickness of the finite for the infinite. That is religion." I thought that was a pretty beautiful way to put it. But yeah, very interesting stuff. I was really fascinated, and I have to say I found, you know, just like these secularists and atheists were finding a kindred spirit in something like Thomas Paine, I was finding a kindred spirit in a lot of the people I was reading about here. And then I followed all that up with Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, and other essays on religion and related subjects. I've had this on my shelf for years, been intending to read it, and I finally decided I'm going to dive into it and get it done, and I did. I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. Now, I'd read certain things by or about Russell, so I knew a little bit here. This is really a collection of some of its essays, like opinion pieces, speeches. These were put together back in 1956, I think. Yeah, I think this was published originally in 1957. So, you know, as somebody who, if you're not new to, you know, atheism or those sorts of, you know, arguments, philosophies, worldviews, nothing in here is going to be necessarily new to you at all. And this is not a book that is trying to convince people who already disagree with it. Okay, like, so for instance, the opening, the titular piece is Why I'm Not a Christian. But this was a speech that he gave to a secular society back in 1927. So essentially he is, you know, if you pardon the expression, he is preaching to the choir. These people already agree with him. He is not trying to convince people who don't agree with him. So this is not like apologetics for atheism. But it's still interesting. He gets into other topics in here, like the free man's worship, what I believe, let me see, the fate of Thomas Paine. He has a whole thing about Thomas Paine and basically about how he was done dirty. So we see even Bertrand Russell, you know, just like the late 19th century atheists and secularists, we also see in the early 20th century Bertrand Russell also fixating on Thomas Paine and finding out, you know, or exploring what happened to him. And he had a little taste of what Thomas Paine went through as well. I'll get to that in a second. The other topics, you've got like nice people, what means nice people, on our sexual ethics, freedom in the colleges, how important colleges were, can religion cure our troubles, that sort of thing. And these are not philosophical pieces. These are more like a philosopher writing opinion pieces. So, you know, you have to understand that you're not exactly getting philosophy in here, if that makes sense. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was the appendix. This is written by the editor, who, can I find his name? Paul Edwards. And the appendix is all about when Russell, he basically got hired to teach at a New York university, and the Catholic Church, including this one sort of activist judge, basically running through the mud. They do a total hatchet job on him. They make him out to seem like he's this, sort of crazed, immoral nudist, that he was promoting things like homosexuality, and that he was ultimately unfit to teach a college course, even though he was already very famous and respected at this time. That's, of course, how they knew about some of his views, that he was unfit to teach a college course in New York City. And unfortunately, the pressure worked, and he was denied that position. But when you read about the things that the lies that the judge was passing, what the church was saying, I think you can understand why somebody like Russell looked at what happened to Thomas Paine and probably saw some parallels in the experience. But yeah, I'm glad that I read this. I thought this was interesting. I think the proper perspective to go into with this is probably to look at it as, what did atheism, free thought, etc. look like in the early 20th century? It's more of a time capsule, because he's commenting a lot on things that were happening in Russia and with fascists and those sorts of things. So it's very much of its time. It is not, I would say go into it with that sort of perspective and view, and you'll have a pretty good experience. So, sorry for the long-winded video, but 3 books that I read at the end of November. And that is, once again, Joseph Campbell, Pathways to Bliss. Let's see if I can put these up here. Yeah, okay. So, Pathways to Bliss, we've got Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell, and finally, The Church of St. Thomas Paine. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts, as always. And also, as always, thank you, booktube.